You're listening to Sustainably Geeky, the podcast for everyday environmentalists.
Hi, you're listening to Sustainably Geeky. Today, we are going to talk about birds, and I have Anna Matthews here, who is the science coordinator for the Oaks and Prairies joint venture at the American Bird Conservancy. So, Anna, thank you so much for being here. Can you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this line of work?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, by the way. I really appreciate it. So I guess this line of work, I think kind of one of the best places to start to explain kind of how I got into this world and what the heck it is that I do is to take a step back and talk about what the heck a migratory bird joint venture is. Because I'm sure that title, Science Coordinator for the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture, didn't mean very much to most of the people that might be listening to a podcast like this. And migratory bird joint ventures are actually like one of the most successful examples of bird conservation programs in North America that no one has ever heard of. So if nothing else today, I hope people will leave like this podcast knowing what a migratory bird joint venture is and how important they are for conservation of birds within North America. So migratory bird joint ventures are these regional partnerships that occur all across North America. They work to conserve habitat for the benefit of birds and other wildlife. And they were originally established back in the 80s when waterfowl populations were in severe decline. And it was so bad that the federal government developed this North American Waterfowl Management Plan that everyone calls NAWAMP, because there's got to be alphabet soup and weird names for all of these different acronyms. And it was designed to implement these strategies that were supposed to bring back waterfowl populations across North America. And the migratory bird joint ventures were supposed to be these regional partnerships across the geography that were actually going to implement these strategies and get that work done. So there are these partnerships of federal agencies, state agencies, nonprofit organizations that are all working together to try to implement these bird population goals within their specific geography. And it worked. Today, wetland and waterfowl populations are one of the only groups in North America that are increasing in terms of bird populations or remain static. Basically, all other groups of birds are in decline, except for waterfowl and wetlands, and that's largely due to a lot of the work that the joint ventures have done. So it's a conservation success story. Today, migratory bird joint ventures work on more than just waterfowl. They work on all species of birds. So I help support within those migratory bird joint ventures within my geography, the Oaks and Prairies joint venture, which covers central Texas and central Oklahoma. I work to support the science that goes into those strategies that we implement to help those bird populations. So I help design the research, the monitoring that answers questions about like, are habitat programs doing what they're supposed to do? You know, how can we be better at habitat management and be more efficient at it and bring back even more birds with the opportunities that we have to do habitat treatments on the ground? You know, how can we learn how to be even better at communicating about science, about these programs to landowners and the general public? And all kinds of other things. So I really feed into that kind of aspect of these migratory bird joint ventures, specifically here within Central Texas and Oklahoma. So that's what I do. So hopefully that gives a better understanding of what the heck it is that I do. But I think your original question is, how did I get here, right?
So yeah, why birds?
Yeah, why birds? So I grew up in Dallas, suburban born and raised. I came from a family that didn't do hunting or fishing or camping or hiking or anything like that. So I ended up getting interested in animals the way that I think most millennial suburban children did. And that was through Animal Planet and Discovery Channel and through going to the zoo, going to public parks and things like that. I loved the Crocodile Hunter as a kid. I loved Jeff Corwin. I loved like Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. That was like my jam. So that's kind of my introduction to wildlife and the outdoors was through the TV. But, you know, that really kind of fostered an interest in wildlife in general and made me ask questions. And I thought for a long time I was going to be a marine biologist because I loved like snorkeling and being on the reefs. And then I discovered that I have a huge phobia of the open ocean and scuba diving. So that kind of went down the drain until I discovered that there's this wildlife degree that you can get at universities, like wildlife biology. Sometimes it's called fisheries and wildlife. So I decided, well, that sounds like exactly what I want to do. So I went to the University of Minnesota and got a degree in wildlife biology for my bachelor's up there. It was very cold, but I really enjoyed my time there. And that's where I discovered birds. I took an ornithology class, and that was kind of all she wrote. I just fell in love with birds. They're fascinating. I had a really supportive professor that helped me get some opportunities to help in his lab to teach about birds to undergrads. And I ended up taking a couple of field jobs, and I took one field job that kind of set me on this career surveys in southwestern Minnesota. And I just fell in love with grassland landscapes. There's nothing quite like standing in the middle of a grassland surrounded by wildflowers, and there's nothing out there except the wind and the birds singing and the grass moving in the wind. It's just amazing. And that was all she wrote. I ended up going to master's to get a wildlife ecology master's degree, where I studied grassland bird densities using a data set from the Oaks and Prairies joint venture. So that's how I got involved with the joint ventures, and that eventually ended up leading into this position that I hold today. So very long story short, I fell in love with birds in college. I did not fall in love with birds as a little kid.
Hey, I mean, some of us didn't discover nature or a lot of this, stuff that you're talking about until we were older. So I think however you get there, as long as you get there, that's what matters. And I love that you pointed out that this was a successful conservation movement, because I think, we hear so much about all of the dangers and all of the dire emergencies happening, especially where, it relates to biodiversity and extinctions and things. So hearing that we can actually fix it if we just, have a concerted effort and we target and do the things that science tells us to do is really encouraging for someone like me who sometimes can get really, bummed out, just hearing the constant barrage of bad news. So I'm glad to know that we are making progress in some areas.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what the American Bird Conservancy does?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So, American Bird Conservancy really focuses on wild bird conservation in the Americas. So, we're not just limited to North America, we work all throughout North, Central, and South America. And I think American Bird Conservancy really focuses on results and partnerships. So we're pretty small. I think just in the past couple of years, we finally passed 100 staff. So we're a pretty small organization, especially compared to some of the other bird and wildlife conservation organizations. So we really have to rely on partnerships in order to get our work done. So we partner with a lot of state and federal agencies and other nonprofits on local levels. Like in South America, I know we partner with local organizations to develop reserves for critically endangered species. But we also work in partnerships here within the Americas. We've got a lot of staff that work across different joint ventures within American Bird Conservancy. So we do a lot of habitat work on the ground in North America through those. And we also do a lot of different work addressing different threats to bird populations. So we have people that work on collisions with buildings, people that work on seabird threats, people that work on shorebird threats. So we do a little bit of everything, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to doing work that shows results. So doing work that actually changes bird populations and feeds into developing habitat or addressing direct threats to birds.
Awesome. So you guys, so it's great to hear that you guys are working, I guess, like you said, within all of the Americas, because obviously birds don't know country borders, so they migrate. Yeah, they migrate all over. So that was one of the questions I had actually was, since birds do tend to migrate hundreds or thousands of miles over the course of a year, just depending on the season, a lot of times it requires international cooperation between countries and states and everything. So how do you guys manage that, and what are some of the challenges you face?
Yeah, so this is a great example of where partnerships like joint ventures come into play. So, like if we take, for example, the Oaks and Prairies joint venture, like I said earlier, we cover like central Texas up into central Oklahoma. And within our geography, during the winter, we are home to a lot of different species of birds that spend their summers breeding up in the northern parts of the US, up into Canada. And then our birds that spend their summers in our geography that breed within the Oaks and Prairies joint venture, we have quite a few species that then go in winter down in Mexico, Central America, South America. And on top of that, there are these flyways that birds use during migration. So they will end up, following the wind patterns essentially to migrate south and then back north again. And Texas happens to be right in the middle of the Central Flyway, which is a huge migratory pathway for many different species of birds. So we have all of these birds that come through this area that don't necessarily breed or winter here, but they might stop during their fall or spring migration to take advantage of some of the habitat that we have so that they can kind of refuel and rest up for the next leg of the journey. So we really have to think about, what are we doing within our geography that affects these populations that spend time elsewhere? And what's going on in these different areas where, some of the birds might call our area home for part of the year, but, these other places that they spend their time, what actions could be going on there that are affecting their populations too? So we have this thing called full annual cycle conservation. It's this concept of doing conservation that is guided by the entire annual cycle of a bird. So thinking about where it breeds, where it migrates through, and where it winters, so that we're doing conservation across all aspects of that, so that we're taking all of it into account. And that really requires us to partner with all of these groups that work in these different geographies of these ranges of these bird species, and that crosses geopolitical boundaries. Sometimes, we have species where we're lucky enough that a lot of their range is just contained within the United States, and that makes a lot of that work relatively easy. But we do have species that do cross those international borders, so that's where partnering across those agencies and making sure that we have plans, that we're developing plans across our priorities and finding common limiting factors that we need to address. Making sure that we're coordinated in our efforts and that we're not contradicting each other's efforts, and that we're instead complementing each other's efforts is really critical. So I think, again, migratory bird joint ventures are a great example of that. We have to work across those boundaries all the time because our partnerships for directing the joint venture and what its priorities are already incorporate a lot of those different partners. So yeah, there's definitely some challenges, but I think working in those partnerships and thinking about that full annual cycle is really how we're going to get conservation done for these species at the scale that it needs to be done in order to effectively change those population trajectories.
Yeah, so why is it important to even, protect birds in the first place? Why are they important to the ecosystem?
Yeah, so we can talk about why birds are important, and there's lots of different examples. I think one of the ways that we tend to think about it is we boil it down to critical ecosystem services. So they help do various things like insect and rodent control. They participate in seed dispersal, pollination, like with hummingbirds. They even can be engineers and architects of different habitats. If you think about woodpeckers developing these cavities and things like that in snags and in forests and all of that. And while I think those are all really, really important and show why birds are a critical part of our ecosystems, and we can directly benefit kind of downstream from some of those. I think there's also a lot of reasons beyond that why birds are a big deal and why they're important for us. So, like one of the big ones that we tend to talk about is that they're really good indicators of like ecosystem health. um, Birds are one, like really, really easy to identify compared to other species. Like if you think about a bird in a tree versus a mouse in a field, which one is easier for you to detect and which one is easier for you to identify with a pair of binoculars? It's going to be the bird. They also sing too, and you can identify birds, by their bird song. So they're really good species for us to be able to count relatively easily and cheaply compared to other species. And they also respond really quickly to changes in the environment. So because of that, they are a good kind of canary in the coal mine. If we are seeing some kind of change in bird populations, then that indicates that there is some kind of change going on in the ecosystem. So they're really good things that we can use for research and science to indicate, whether or not our conservation efforts are successful. They're also a big part of the economy. I was looking this up earlier. Birds contribute a whopping $40 billion annually in the US, and that's through like, people buying bird seed and binoculars, and like birders go on these crazy like birding trips to like South Texas and to Alaska to get more birds on their checklists. So it's big business.
Yeah, ecotourism.
Yeah, and there's like whole, local economies built around that. I mean, like a hotel industry and food industries are built around birders in some locations because other people don't necessarily have a reason to, go to these far-flung parts of the United States other than, a bird person that wants to go find that one crazy bird that only shows up in that one place. So, yeah, it's big. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I guess there is something exciting about it. It's almost like catching Pokemon, like
Yeah, yeah.
you're going to see when, but if you can claim to have seen that one rare bird.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, when that, what was it? I think it was like the Pokemon Go app or something like that came out. It's like, we already do that. We do that with birds.
Right.
But I think the one last thing that I want to mention though about why birds are important, and I think it's the one that people don't think about as often. I mean, we could talk about money, we can talk about ecosystem services, we can talk about science, but I mean, birds are just beautiful and they're interesting and they're fun to watch. They're super charismatic. I mean, they're just I can't imagine a world that doesn't have like, birds or bird songs in it. I don't want to imagine a world like that. Everyone has a bird story, whether it was when you were feeding ducks in the park or, you had this pigeon like in the middle of like this urban area that you spend a lot of time with and it was doing some kind of crazy behavior. And I think that's like birds are one of the few groups of animals where, regardless of where you live, regardless of like if you live in a skyscraper or you live out in the middle of the country, you have access to birds. So everyone has a bird story. Everyone is able to experience them in some way, shape, or form. And they're super interesting. And I love them. And I think that's perfectly good reason for why they're important too.
Yeah, those are all great reasons. And I am 100% behind that things shouldn't have to matter to humans to be important when it comes to nature and other living creatures, but a lot of people don't think that way. So it is good to have these other reasons to be able to point to, but the overall, gist of it is, they are beautiful creatures that share this planet with us, and they deserve protection and space on the planet just as much as we do. So that alone should be enough. But we know that there's all these other reasons too that kind of builds the case, and services and all that. And yeah, I live in a city in Ireland, Galway, on right on the Atlantic, so we get a lot of fearless seagulls and other birds that are very adapted to human presence. So, they'll just come up and snag your bag in the park or, whatever, just looking for food. So, yeah, definitely have those experiences, like you said.
Yep, everyone's got a bird story. I haven't met a single person yet that doesn't have one.
Yeah, and they can get vicious, like when they don't fear humans, man.
Definitely.
Um, yeah, let's talk a little more about birders because that is an interesting culture that I personally have never partaken in, but I have friends who have, and I actually went to one with questions for this podcast. So when it comes to kind of following the birds, like you said, and it's a form of ecotourism and kind of a personal challenge to see how many you can find. A lot of times, people will use, I don't know whether it's artificial or their own, they'll use other means to kind of try to attract the birds. Is that ideal, or does that kind of mess with the balance of nature when people do things like that?
So I think there's been a lot of studies done about bird feeders over the years. It's not something that I directly work with within my position, so I'm certainly not an expert on it. But from what I've seen and what I've experienced, bird feeders can definitely be helpful. Like if we think about the crazy freeze that Texas had a couple years ago, where the entire state shut down because none of us had any power, that was a really good example of like where bird feeders are really important. I was tossing out bird seed like constantly into my backyard while that was going on, and it was disappearing faster than I could put it out, basically, because all of these birds were just so desperate for energy and resources that they couldn't get because it was cold and there was snow everywhere and all of their usual food sources weren't available. So I think if we think about it in that context, bird feeders and supplemental feeding in that kind of sense can be really beneficial in the face of like extreme drought and extreme winters and things like that. And overall, I don't necessarily think that feeding birds really is that huge of a disruption in our ecosystem, especially if we're thinking in like suburban and urban environments where we've already taken away habitat. Bird feeders might be providing an opportunity for some of those species to persist. But again, I'm certainly not an expert in all of that. One thing I do want to mention, though, is that bird feeders, I kind of like to think of them as like a buffet for birds, right? So when you go to the buffet, they have like the sneeze guards and all of that, right, around the salad bar and stuff like that. But all it takes is like one person that isn't feeling too good with like dirty hands, and then all of a sudden everyone that eats the pasta salad that day is sick. So bird feeders are kind of like that. They're a buffet for birds. All it takes is, a couple of sick individuals eating at your bird feeder, and then all of a sudden, all of the birds that come to your bird feeder could potentially be exposed. So diseases like conjunctivitis and house finches or bird pox. When you have bird feeders up, you want to clean them pretty frequently so that you're reducing the possibility of those diseases being passed to other birds that visit your feeders. It's also good too to keep an eye on your birds and be prepared to take your feeders down for a little bit if you do start to notice some illness coming up in your birds that are visiting your feeders. And then I also want to mention that bird feeders are a buffet for predators too. So you really want to think about where you're putting your bird feeders and who you're letting out like into your backyard when birds are at your feeders. So, unsuspecting birds at a bird feeder are a really great opportunity for like a domestic house cat that is outside to get a nice snack. So we really want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on the animals that we allow around those feeders.
Yeah, and other critters might enjoy, like squirrels and things like that. So I guess placement is probably important as well. So you're not feeding the other, like you said, the rodents that you don't want. So that's interesting. I never thought about bird feeders as possibly being conduits for illness, but I mean, that makes sense. Like you said, it's basically a buffet. So definitely if you have a bird feeder, it's something to think about. And I know like for the very brief moment in time when I tried to have a hummingbird feeder in Texas, the advice was to change the feed like every day or two because it got so hot and that syrupy water could basically turn to alcohol or something. So we don't want to make them sick from the things we're giving them either, I guess.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So As far as, birders trying to find birds through bird calls or something like that, is that something that you think is, or making the noises or playing the sound, is that something that you think can be harmful, or is there
So
not
like
really
doing
any?
playbacks out in the field,
Yeah.
to try to draw birds in? Yes, that's actually a really good question. So yeah, you'll see sometimes people using their phone to play a bird song to try to call a bird in so that they can get a closer look at it. Or sometimes you'll see people out in like in a park doing this thing called pishing, where they make this weird sound that is kind of, every birder does a little bit different, but it sounds like kind of a psh psh sound to try to bring birds into them.
Mhm.
And I think that I always recommend to people to not play bird songs to draw birds in, because you have to think about, what are you doing to that bird, that what are you interrupting them from? So, like for example, if you play a bird song during the breeding season, you are that those bird songs are typically territorial songs that the male sings in order to indicate that, hey, this is my area, this is my mates over here, like stay away. This is where I live, and all of you other cardinals, I don't want you anywhere over here. So when you play a bird song like that, the local male might think, oh, my territory is being invaded. So he'll stop what he's doing and come over and check it out and be all prepared to potentially like chase off this other male. So you're not only interrupting him from defending his territory from actual threats, you're interrupting him from potentially feeding his mate, from feeding his young. You might be inducing some kind of like hormonal response. Like if you think about it, his adrenaline might be getting up a little bit, so he might be consuming energy a little bit faster than he typically would. So when you do things like call in birds like that, you have to be really careful about it, because you don't want to be interrupting these species from, you know, doing these normal behaviors and potentially inducing some kind of negative effect in them. Uh, and a really, really, especially, you don't want to do these with species that are extremely rare or endangered or threatened as well. But I just as a rule of thumb, I really encourage people to not do that for any kind of species. You might occasionally see scientists doing it, and they're doing it where they've really thought out about exactly how they're going to do it and why they're doing it. They have really, really good reason. But if everyone goes out and starts doing playbacks like that, all of a sudden you have entire populations that are having behaviors disrupted. So, yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, I actually thought about it from listening to another podcast about noise, and they mentioned that specifically for owls. But I thought, well, that has to be an issue with bird call, because yeah, like if for nothing else, like, wouldn't you be annoyed if your day was interrupted because someone was, playing a song and you got woken up from your nap or whatever? So even if you're
Yeah.
not interrupting something, like life or death, it's still just annoying. So um, let's be good neighbors and not interrupt our avian friends,
Exactly.
just so we can see them and check them off a list. Yeah, thanks for sharing that though. That's really good to know if people are kind of interested in getting into bird watching, or just already into it and maybe do that practice. I guess, can we talk about some of the biggest threats to bird populations? Obviously, human activity is probably responsible for a lot of them, but yeah, can you kind of expand on some of the things that you guys see through your work?
Yeah, so I can boil it down to, I think, three big ones. And like you said, all of them are basically because of people. So habitat loss is the biggest, most immediate threat. I was pulling some numbers earlier, and I liked the analogy that they drew. So we've lost more than 290 million acres of grasslands in North America due to conversion to agricultural lands. That translates apparently into 130 Yellowstone national parks. That's a
Wow.
lot. So, habitat loss due to conversion to agricultural lands is, of course, big. Due to conversion to urban and suburban, environments is also really big. But I think one of the ones that we forget about a lot is um, we also experience habitat loss due to suppression of like natural processes in the environment. So for example, if we think about grasslands in Texas, a lot of our grasslands are used as grazing land. And historically, those grasslands would have been maintained by a mix of native grazers, so bison, and occasional fires. So most of the grasslands within Texas had to experience fire historically approximately every 3 years, and that's what helped maintain them. So we've done a lot of suppression of those. We don't have bison anymore. We've replaced them with cattle, and we also suppressed fire. So we also experience habitat loss within our areas that aren't converted to agriculture or suburban and urban environments because we've suppressed those, and we have things like shrub encroachment occurring on what was historically grasslands, or we're experiencing invasive species due to putting in grasses that are supposed to be more beneficial for cattle, and other things like this. I think there was a study that came out a couple years ago called The Decline of the North American Avifauna. And this movement called the 3 Billion Birds initiative kind of came out of it. And that study estimated that we've lost around 3 billion birds in North America alone across all of these different kind of groups of birds. And grasslands are the ones that, grassland birds are the group that showed the most severe and steep declines. 74% of all of our grassland bird species in North America are in decline. That's almost 700 million of those 3 billion birds that we've lost. So habitat loss is really like a huge driver. But looming in the future, we also have climate change effects. We're already starting to see some of those due to shifts in some of the range of our bird species, and through effects through some of these like extreme weather events, such as that winter, again, that we had in Texas a couple years ago. That was so bad. We had that huge freeze, but also through things like more frequent hurricanes. All of those have the potential to affect our bird populations as well, and we do see direct effects on them through mortality due to that freeze, or due to destruction of coastal habitats from hurricanes, etc. And then the last big one that I want to mention is just a lack of resources. So in order to change the trajectories of these populations, we have to do a lot of work on private lands and a lot of education. And we do have thousands of people out there that work as private lands biologists, that work with landowners to help them understand how they can kind of meet in the middle to meet their agricultural needs, but how they can also meet wildlife needs at the same time. But we need more people that can do that, because we're talking about thousands of biologists that need to work with millions of private landowners, and billions of people that we need to understand the importance of birds and habitats, and these are the people that are making policy decisions, right? So we need more money to do that, and we need more people to do that. So anyone that's listening that's interested in a career with wildlife, we need more private lands biologists, and we need people that are able to talk to the public about the importance of birds and what they can do to help birds. So you could be one of those people that's helping us.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the importance of private lands, because my research topic right now is looking at conservation easements and the challenges, but also the opportunities for land conservation through private land ownership. So I think that's, in everything I've been reading, it ties right into what you're saying. There's a huge opportunity to preserve some of these ecosystems through private lands and through just individual efforts, but obviously collective as well, everybody doing it on their own together. So yeah, that's a great message. And what you said about climate change and habitat loss being threats, those are really interconnected, right? Because as climate change gets worse, it kind of leads to that. So it's like this feedback loop of just bad stuff.
Yeah.
That again kind of goes back to human activity. So hopefully people will see that connection and, kind of
Yeah.
take it
That
seriously.
that connection between, climate change and habitat loss too, by doing habitat conservation, by making sure that we have lots of habitat for those species, that also kind of helps protect us against some of those range shifts and some of those effects of climate change, right? Because we're building resiliency into these populations. So if there's one catastrophic weather event, we don't run the risk of losing the last remaining population of this one species of bird.
Mhm.
So those two really tie together, I think. And I didn't mention these in detail, but I do want to make sure that people know that there are lots of other threats too.
Mhm.
That some of these other threats might be things that people are more able to address in their day-to-day lives, and that includes things like bird collisions with windows in urban and suburban areas, the use of pesticides, even in your garden. If you have birds, visiting your garden and eating all of your strawberries, you might want to think about not using pesticides on those. In fisheries, overfishing is a really big issue as well, because that affects, the food sources for seabirds, invasive species and domestic cats, and even plastics. All of those are threats to birds as well. So don't think that the story just ends with climate change and habitat loss.
Yeah.
There are lots of other things contributing too.
Can you talk briefly about light pollution and how that can affect,
Ooh,
because I know there's been a lot of studies on that, and also stories about, like, for example, the 9/11 memorial. They had birds getting stuck in that vortex, and they had to turn it off for a certain number of hours to kind of let the birds be free, because they would just get like hypnotized into the light. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about how that affects birds as well?
yeah, that's definitely not one of my areas of expertise, but I will tell you what I know. And there's definitely other people at American Bird Conservancy that know a lot more than I do. So basically, like light pollution, especially like light pollution at night, the big thing there is a lot of these birds that migrate, they migrate at night. And a lot of their sense of direction comes from like light from the night sky, right? So when you have a city full of, ambient light coming from skyscrapers, coming from, all of the street lights, things like that, that kind of messes with their ability to navigate. So they might end up getting really confused as they migrate through some of these urban areas. And that can lead to, building collisions. It can lead to them kind of like getting off track and getting potentially trapped, like you said, in that vortex of light. So there's actually a lot of initiatives right now to try to get cities to turn off a lot of those lights during the migration period to help reduce some of that confusion and those risks as those birds pass through those urban areas. So that's about all that I know about those topics, but there's a lot of resources out there online to kind of help explain exactly what's going on and what you can do even within like your local community or your neighborhood to try to reduce the amount of ambient light that you have going on at night.
Yeah, and it actually did an episode on light pollution a couple years ago, episode 13, and it talks more than just birds. But if you're interested in learning more about light pollution, and I think it is worthy to note that Texas recently was approved a dark sky preserve, like one of the largest or the largest dark skies preserves in West Texas a few months ago, out where the Big Bend area is, correct, and it's also partnership with Mexico. So that's a pretty cool thing that we have going on in Texas, and an international agreement even to help protect wildlife and dark skies.
Yes.
Oh, let's see. We were talking about threats to birds. Something else that we hear a lot about these days are wind turbines, and that's actually one of the big arguments against wind power, is that they are avian murder machines. So, what are your thoughts on this, and or what does the science show, I should say? Because I know there are bird deaths that result from this, but there's also bird deaths that result from climate change, and sensibly wind power will help with that. So, what is the science
Yeah, so there's a lot that
say?
there's a lot that we're still learning about, wind energy and birds and their migratory paths and all of their behaviors and their kind of day-to-day patterns and things like that. Um, that's again, I do more kind of the landscape level kinds of conservation. So I don't necessarily work a lot with wind energy specifically, and we actually have some staff at ABC that work directly with those kinds of issues. But what I can tell you is that, like you were saying, and we were just talking about earlier, climate change is this huge looming threat, and we have to do something about it. And that means that we have to switch away from fossil fuels and we have to utilize renewable energy sources. Wind is a big one of those. I think wind energy in the long term is something that we are going to have to use, but we can be smart about how we use it. We do see mortality at wind turbine facilities for birds, and we especially see it for bats. Bats are pretty negatively affected by wind energy facilities. So we can think about, where are we putting those wind energy plants? Where are we putting them? Right in the middle of a gigantic migratory pathway for birds? Are we putting them in critical habitat where, in order to put up those turbines, we have to put in roads, we have to put in like these pads so that we can, put up those turbines? If we think about those kinds of things before we go into, developing those wind energy facilities, I think that could go a long ways to kind of trying to find this happy medium between having this renewable energy source, but also, doing bird conservation. And like I said, we're still learning a lot. There's a lot of people that are studying the effects of wind energy facilities on wildlife, including birds and bats. And we're studying a lot about, how birds move and how they migrate. With the advent of, satellite tracking technology that you can put on a bird, we've learned so much in just the past, 10 to 20 years about migratory movements and where birds move through. And same thing with like citizen science data that's collected through platforms like eBird, where, all of those birders that, go nuts about their lists, they can put their lists into eBird and associate it with geographic locations. We now have better understandings about, the timing of migrations and exactly kind of where those migrations travel through, just through data like that as well, which can kind of help contribute to an understanding of where we might want to think about where we put these kinds of facilities so that we don't negatively affect bird populations.
Yeah, that's I think as with anything else that humans do, we should think about, like you said, how it will affect the specific landscape we're looking at developing. So, yeah, just because it's open land and it's windy doesn't mean it's maybe the best location for that.
Yeah.
Thinking through some of those other nuances, for sure. Well, I guess let's kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about, in the work that you do, I guess, is there anything related specifically to your ability to do your work, or I guess, is there resistance that you meet, or funding, or any other challenges to physically actually do the work?
Not that I can really think of off the top of my head. I think that we have a lot of support from, the partners that are involved with the work that we do, ranging from, Texas Parks and Wildlife and the Fish and Wildlife Service and, Audubon and Quail Forever. We've got a lot of, different agencies and organizations that are all participating and trying to do conservation on this scale. I think it just boils down to the sheer scale of the problem that we're trying to address. Within the geography of the Oaks and Prairies joint venture, we estimated that we have to restore 3 million acres of grassland habitat in order to reverse the trend of bobwhite, like northern bobwhite decline. And that's kind of that species has such a big territory size that if we restore that much grassland, then it'll encompass a lot of the needs of other species as well that are kind of our priority and target species for bird conservation in the geography. 3 million acres is a lot. It's a lot just within that one geography. So, trying to find programs that help us do that and then find people to implement those programs, I think is a lot harder than anything else that we do within the Oaks and Prairies joint venture. We have this program called the Grassland Restoration Incentive Program, which works with landowners within kind of select counties to try to help them do habitat treatments on their properties that benefit grassland birds. We never are short of like projects. There's always people that are interested in doing projects with us. I think it's more we don't have the number of biologists like we were talking about earlier to be able to interact with enough landowners right now to, really like move the needle as much as we need to move it in order to reach that 3 million acre goal. So we can do it. We know what we need to do in order to change those trajectories. It's just, do we have the funding and the resources to make that happen?
Yeah. So do you think you're getting, your industry or your field is getting the support it needs from the government? I know you work at a state level, but from maybe the state and federal government, or is there more that could be done to kind of support the work that you all are doing and other people working on conservation?
No, we definitely have, support. The state wildlife agencies, Texas Parks and Wildlife and Oklahoma Department of Wildlife, they contribute to that habitat program that I mentioned earlier. They support and help guide the priorities of the joint venture. They're both members of the management board of the joint venture, of the work that we do. We partner a lot with federal agricultural programs through NRCS. So a lot of those agricultural programs like EQIP and CRP and CSP, I know it's a lot of alphabet soup, but that's like the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, the Conservation Reserve Program, Conservation Stewardship. All of these different agricultural-based programs are also being used to the benefit of wildlife. So I think there's a lot of support out there, and certainly from the NRCS and those agricultural programs, we've got a lot of crossover between the goals of the state agencies and what we need to do for bird conservation and habitat conservation to support those birds. So there's definitely a lot of I think overlap in the work that we do, and we can't do it like that joint venture partnership. It only exists because we have the buy-in and the support from all of those groups.
Well, that's good, and that's encouraging to know that it is a priority for government as well as the private sector. It just sounds like the biggest issues, as with anything, is funding and, of course, manpower. So
yeah.
Well, so since you've brought it up a couple times, it sounds like there's kind of a shortage of, people working in this field. What would be your suggestions or advice for someone that may be interested in working, whether they're just starting out, going to school and want to shift into the field?
Yeah, so if you are just starting out, you're in high school still or in the early stages of your college career, we do have degree paths at a lot of different universities for rangeland ecology or wildlife biology, or sometimes there's like different applied ecology tracks and things like that. So I'd really recommend that you look into those degree programs. And a lot of what I've talked about is private lands and private lands biologists. So one thing that we've noticed kind of over the past few years is we have a lot of people like me that come out of those programs that have a good understanding of the ecology of wildlife systems and natural history and all of those things, but they don't have a lot of experience working in rural landscapes. They don't have a good understanding of how agriculture works. So I think if you're going to school and you have this goal of being able to work with landowners, of being able to be on the ground and actually creating habitat with those landowners for these species, it's really important for you to try to take a couple of agriculture classes or get involved in your community in some way to learn about, some of those rural activities that might be tied into agriculture in some way. So maybe getting involved with like your local like rodeo shows, or even like a markets where they're selling cattle and things like that, trying to understand, what are the priorities for those kinds of landowners, and what are they thinking about? Because that's what you need to understand as a private lands biologist, to go and have conversations with landowners that have those kinds of priorities and show them where you can meet in the middle. So I think that's one of the big ones that I've seen recently. But also know that, if you're coming into this later in life, I've met plenty of people that have kind of switched from geography into, rangeland ecology or wildlife biology. I've known some people that have switched from, I think, even like communications into wildlife biology. So I think there's a lot of different avenues, but you just might need to kind of go back and fill in some of those gaps that you might not have had an opportunity to learn about so far. And also don't forget that there's plenty of opportunities to work in urban settings too. So we have urban biologists that work in the cities through Texas Parks and Wildlife to help guide like urban biology programs for conservation, and different outreach and education programs as well. So there's lots of opportunities to get involved at a lot of different scales.
Yeah, that's great. And I would think yeah, like you said, maybe if you're not interested in working in this full time, there's still things that people can do to help. So what would you suggest if someone maybe is interested in birds or conservation, but doesn't want to, make it a career? How can they kind of help your efforts, or just be a citizen scientist, I guess?
Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier. There was that 3 Billion Birds initiative that came about after the publication came out that said that we'd lost approximately 3 billion birds in North America. And they actually outline really well like 7 relatively easy actions that, your average urbanite or suburbanite can do. So we can go through those, and then I've got a couple in addition to that. So thinking about like what you can do around home, right? So you can try to work within your home to make windows safer for birds. So putting stickers up on your windows, there's all kinds of strategies that you can do to kind of help reduce window collisions. Or even like working with your office, if you have an office that's open, so doing things like that, that could be a big one as well. Working to try to keep your cats indoors, and find alternative solutions to giving them the kind of outdoor stimulus. There's all kinds of strategies. I actually have a friend that walks her cat on a leash. So there's
I bet the
some
cat loves
kind of,
that.
yeah. So there's all kinds of strategies to help keep your cats indoors and reduce mortality of birds due to cats. Planting more native plants and providing, nesting cover, nectar providing plants that pollinators, or like not only hummingbirds but other native pollinators like native bees require. That's another big one. Avoiding pesticides, of course. And this is one of my favorites, drinking bird-friendly coffee. That is a thing, and I'll talk about it more a little bit later, I think. Reducing your use of plastics, especially single-use plastics. But their seventh one that they mention is one that we brought up earlier, is, just enjoying birds and sharing what you see. So using platforms like eBird to share sightings that you have of birds, even in your backyard, that's useful data, and it's also fun. So just make sure that you enjoy birds and share that enjoyment with other people, whether it's, through keeping a list on an eBird app, or, going birding with your friends, or just walking through a park and showing your friend, hey, that's a northern cardinal. That's a step in the right direction too. Beyond the 7, though, if you do own land, think about working with a wildlife biologist or other experts to try to develop a wildlife management plan that incorporates, actions on your property that can be beneficial for birds and other wildlife. And of course, don't forget about the power of your voice within, determining politics, actions within your community, your neighborhoods, that might benefit birds as well. So,
As you were going through that list and you mentioned windows, it made me think of, the birds that are hundreds of stories tall. I don't know how high they go, but they're a lot of times nothing but glass. So is that an issue with birds since they're so tall and they are so shiny? I mean, do you hear about a lot of birds crashing into those?
Yeah, there are actually some groups that I can't remember what they're called. I might have to look this up later and see if I can find the link for y'all. They survey underneath these skyscrapers and collect birds that have died from hitting the skyscraper. So we actually have data out there that tells us, the amount of mortality that some of these skyscrapers cause in some of these bird populations. Kind of like we were talking about light earlier. A lot of that I think tends to happen during migration. These birds are flying through and all they see is just a reflection of the sky, so they think it's more sky and they get confused and hit the window. But it's not just tall buildings too, like short buildings that are have walls of glass can also have these kinds of effects. There was something I was looking at before. It's actually like the reflections of vegetation and things like that, like around your windows on your house or like outside your office window. We have less data just because not as many people are collecting data on those kinds of situations. Skyscrapers are a relatively easy one to collect data on, but it's also not an insignificant source of mortality as well, I believe.
Interesting. So many things that you just don't think about until you start talking through these issues, and then you realize, wow, what an impact our things that we take for granted have on nature in general, not just birds, but it makes you kind of wonder how much of it is actually necessary and how much we could do without or well, and so interesting, and I know I've learned a lot. Is there anything else you haven't already talked about that you want to throw out there before we move on to our green life hacks?
I think the only thing that I want to throw out there are potentially some resources for anyone that's interested in getting into birds, if that's okay.
Definitely.
Yeah, so, if you are just interested in learning more about birds, you know nothing or you know very little, I highly recommend that you check out David Attenborough's Life of Birds. It is an amazing series that takes you through all kinds of crazy behaviors and crazy songs that birds do all across the world. You're going to see birds that you're like, I didn't even realize that was a possibility. So I highly recommend it, and I think it's great to get kids interested as well. I also really recommend that if you're kind of just starting out and you want to learn more about identification or natural history of some of these species, take a look at websites like Cornell's Lab of Ornithology. That's a really great resource. And go get yourself a bird book, like a bird identification book. I started with the National Geographic Field Guide to Birds of North America. That's a really kind of beginner-friendly book. It's not overwhelming, but it has just the right amount of information, I think, and it's set up in a really kind of friendly way. But there's also great apps too. Another kind of good one for beginners is the Merlin Bird ID app. And it's got this amazing new feature now. I think it's been out for a little while, but I just discovered it relatively recently. They basically have Shazam for birds. So you can,
Wow.
you can press a button on this app and it will listen to the bird song around you. And it'll start identifying the birds that it's hearing, which is just amazing. It uses machine learning and all kinds of cool, library resources of recordings that are stored within Cornell to do this. But it's just incredible, and it actually is relatively accurate. There's some species where it's not so great, but in my experience, it doesn't do a half bad job. So yeah, I highly recommend you check those out. And then just check out your local bird conservation organizations and your local, state agencies as well. They put out a lot of resources, and they have people that, their job is to work with the community, to work with citizen scientists. So there's all kinds of opportunities to get involved that you might not be aware of, but you just got to do a little bit of digging into some of their websites and resources.
Yeah, those are great, and we will link those in the show notes if you're interested in following up with any of that. You mentioned, the weird birds out there, and it made me think of when I visited Australia. Well, initially, I was just fascinated by all the colorful birds, the lorikeets, and all the things that were just everywhere. You didn't even have to go into a rainforest; it was just like on a tree in the middle of the city. But the one that I thought was the coolest was the cassowary because it just looks like a dinosaur. I
Yes.
know it's a flightless bird, but it was still just like terrifying. But I couldn't stop, like searching for one in the wild. So, yeah.
Yeah. A more local bird that also is very dinosaur-like too. If you've ever seen a group of wild turkeys running across the field, there is nothing that looks more like velociraptors than a turkey running across the field, and you can just kind of see the shape of the body and the head peeking out. So there's cool birds, halfway around the world, but yeah, there's some pretty cool ones right here at home that might show up in your backyard too that have weird behaviors and all of that. So yeah, Australia, oh my God, the birds there are so amazing.
Yeah, all the animals there, but yeah, I mean, I was just blown away. Um, do you have a favorite bird? Or would you
Ooh,
feel guilty picking just one?
that's like asking a parent to choose a favorite child, I
I
think.
know.
I think my favorite bird changes every day.
Mm,
But the one that stays consistent, I can't choose just one group of bird or one specific bird. I'll say that I really like corvids, so that's anything like crows, ravens, jackdaws, magpies, jays. Those are all in the corvid family of birds. I love those guys. They're just so incredibly smart, and they have so many interesting like things that they do. They use tools. There's some species of those birds that use tools, which is just incredible to me. And the problem solving skills are just amazing. But something that's a little bit more relevant to the work that I do, and something else I'd like to mention is I really like sparrows. So
mm,
sparrows are your typical like little brown bird that no one knows how to identify because it just looks like a little brown bird.
yeah.
But there's some really really cool sparrows out there. For example, the Cassin sparrow is amazing. They look super boring. They're like one of the most boring sparrows to look at, and sparrows are already kind of boring to look at because they're a little brown bird. But they have this really cool behavior where they do this thing called skylarking. So they'll fly up into the sky and they'll reach a point where they almost seem to like hang for a moment. And then as they kind of slowly descend and like flutter down on their wings, they'll sing their song. And it's just incredible. But unless you're paying attention to those little brown birds, you might never know about those kinds of things. So I think the corvids and then some of those like lesser known but little brown birds are my favorite ones today.
Tomorrow it'll change.
Yep, exactly.
Wow. So thank you again for all this information. You've given a lot to think about. I guess let's go ahead and move on to our green life hack. And this is the part of the show where we share one thing that listeners can do to kind of help them live more sustainably, maybe reduce their carbon footprint. So would you like to go first, Anna?
Yeah, so I've got kind of one thing, but there are technically two, so apologies. I can't pick a favorite bird. I can't pick a favorite life hack.
That's fine.
Um, so one of them, I actually mentioned this earlier, is one of like the 7 things that the 3 Billion Birds Initiative recommended. Bird-friendly coffee. So I'm one of those people. I really struggle to do like gardening or thrifting or things like that. So if you're like me, bird-friendly coffee, thinking about what you're buying at the grocery store is one way to kind of think about how you can live a little bit more greener. So bird-friendly coffee is a certification program through the Smithsonian that is those certifications are given to coffee producers that promote doing like coffee plantations that have a mix of different like foliage covers and vegetation heights and other things that promote bird diversity. So it's not just like only coffee plants. They have other plants mixed in that support, diverse bird populations. And then along with that, there's this other program called conservation ranching within Audubon that gives landowners a bird-friendly beef like certification for the beef that they produce on their property. So they can get this certification through doing like good grassland stewardship practices on their ranches, and if they go through this approval process with Audubon and meet some certain requirements, they can get this certification for bird-friendly beef. So if you want to buy beef at the store that's a little bit more like conservation minded and like comes from places that are doing good practices for birds, that's an option for you. It can be a little bit hard to find, but I believe their website should indicate like where retailers are for that product.
Yeah, I had heard of course, like Rainforest Alliance coffee, but I've never heard of bird-friendly coffee, so that's good to know for our coffee drinkers out there.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna just kind of echo one of the things you said earlier for my green life hack, which is to plant native plants that will support your local bird population. So maybe look up what some of the birds in your area are, or what there should be. Maybe they aren't because there's no habitat for them, and kind of try to go to a local nursery and plant something to support that population. A lot of times you can also, I think in Texas, contact like your local AgriLife extension or something similar, depending on the state or the region you're in. So there's usually plenty of information out there. Your local master gardeners or naturalists could probably help you out too, or Google. But yeah, I would say just try to make your landscape more bird friendly if you can. So that's my green life hack.
Oh, I like it.
Yeah. So, where can we find you and or the American Bird Conservancy online?
So I am not personally a big social media person, but you can find me on LinkedIn. So you're welcome to find me there and reach out to me if you have questions or anything like that. For American Bird Conservancy, you can find us on our website. We also have a lot of different social media platforms that we interact with through American Bird Conservancy as well. So check us out there. And the last website that I'd like to kind of plug and make sure that you're aware of is the Migratory Bird Joint Venture website. It's mbjv.org. And this is a website where you can go to find out more about the work that the joint ventures do. So remember, there's a migratory bird joint venture wherever you live within the United States and within the majority of Canada and Mexico. So I highly encourage you to find out, who is your local migratory bird joint venture, and they should have maps on that website to help you figure that out. And then go and see kind of what work they're doing, who are they partnering with, what are their projects. And that might be a good way to kind of figure out what you might be able to do within your area to help contribute to bird conservation as well.
Awesome. Yeah, and the American Bird Conservancy is a nonprofit, so if folks want to donate or volunteer, I'm assuming they can also do that through the website, correct?
Yes, exactly. Yep, we are a nonprofit, and we do end up a lot of the donations that we receive from individuals goes directly to addressing habitat issues and threats and doing habitat projects on the ground. So yes, there are certainly plenty of opportunities to get involved through donations and also opportunities to get engaged in other ways with the American Bird Conservancy.
Okay, great. You can find me personally here on Sustainably Geeky, occasionally on Marginally Geeky, our sister show, and then our parent show, Epically Geeky. And you can find me as well on social media on Instagram and Twitter at HetsGonnaBeMe. You can find the show on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, as well as pretty much any podcast site that you use. So please check us out, subscribe. And if you have any ideas for future topics or guests, feel free to send those our way through our website or through social media. Anna, again, thank you so much for being on. And for everyone listening, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.